Dateline, Late Gulf, October 25, 1944. The waters off the Philippines shimmered under a bright morning sun as Task Unit 77.4.3, Taffy 3, steamed eastward, its small escort carriers recovering aircraft after the furious running battles of the previous day. Smoke still stained the horizon from the epic clash of Late Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. Many American sailors thought the worst was over. It was not. At 10:53 a.m., a lookout aboard the escort carrier USS St. Vaux, CVE-63, spotted approaching aircraft. 4 Japanese Zeros low on the horizon bore down on the task group. Anti-aircraft gunners manned their posts, expecting the familiar arc of dive bombing or torpedo runs. Instead, something unprecedented unfolded. The lead pilot, Lieutenant Yukio Seki of the 201st Air Group, held his course. He did not pull up to release a bomb or veer into a torpedo run. Instead, he drove straight at the carrier's flight deck in a steepening dive. Gunfire erupted from the St. Louis 20mm Oerlikons and 40mm Bofors, shells bursting around the Zero in white flashes, but the aircraft did not break away. At 10:56, Seki Zero slammed into the flight deck, its 250-kilogram bomb erupting in a violent orange fireball. Aviation fuel tanks ignited, and secondary explosions tore through parked Wildcats and Avengers. Within minutes, flames engulfed the carrier. By 11:25 a.m., the St. Louis rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the sea, taking 114 American sailors with her. What the Americans had witnessed was not merely a desperate crash, but the first organized kamikaze attack of the war. For the men of Taffy 3, the realization was staggering. Their enemy had unleashed a weapon that defied conventional logic, one that required no escape plan, no chance of survival, only the certainty of destruction. Commander Robert Copeland of the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts later reflected, "We had seen Japanese pilots dive into ships before, but this was different. They were trained to do it, ordered to do it. It was the beginning of a new kind of war." For the Japanese, this radical tactic emerged from desperation. The summer of 1944 had devastated their naval air arm. The loss of Saipan placed American B-29s within striking distance of Tokyo. In June, the Battle of the Philippine Sea had annihilated more than 400 Japanese aircraft in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By autumn, Japan's carrier groups were nearly empty of trained aviators. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, made the fateful proposal on October 19, 1944. "In my opinion, there is only one way left to swing the war in our favor. That is to crash dive our planes into the enemy's carriers, each plane crashing into one warship." Within a week, his Kamikaze Special Attack Force had taken flight over Late Gulf. From that day until the war's end, kamikazes would become the terror of the Pacific. Between late 1944 and August 1945, they launched over 3,800 sorties, sinking 34 U.S. warships and damaging 368 more. Nearly 5,000 young Japanese pilots perished in the effort. For the U.S. Navy, the first months were grim. Their ships bristled with guns, 5-inch dual-purpose batteries, rapid-firing 40mm Bofors, 20mm Oerlikons. But these weapons had been designed against conventional bombers and torpedo planes. Standard timed fuses or contact shells were too imprecise against a suicide plane committed to its dive. Many kamikazes absorbed multiple hits and still plowed into their targets. Admiral William F. Halsey summarized the Navy's frustration. "No commander could guarantee protection. We had plenty of firepower in plenty, but these attacks cut straight through our defenses." The kamikaze appeared unstoppable. Sailors whispered grimly that nothing short of annihilating every Japanese airfield could save them. Yet far from Leyte Gulf, in guarded warehouses and locked crates, another possibility already existed. It was a fuse, no larger than a flashlight battery, that contained a tiny vacuum tube, a radio transmitter, and a receiver. When it sensed the reflection of its own signal from an aircraft nearby, it detonated the shell automatically. Officially called the Variable Time Fuse, or VT fuse, it had been developed in secrecy, rivaling that of the atomic bomb. At Leyte Gulf, the sea turned to fire under the Kamikaze's first assault. But in the months ahead, this hidden invention would transform the Pacific skies, cutting suicide success rates by as much as 85%. The Americans did not know it yet, but the balance was about to shift. Long before the Kamikazes appeared over Leyte Gulf, a quiet revolution had been unfolding in the laboratories of American industry. The challenge was as old as anti-aircraft warfare itself: how to detonate a shell near a fast-moving target without requiring a direct hit. Conventional timed fuses and mechanical predictors were clumsy, often exploding harmlessly yards away. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance wanted something better: a device that could sense its own proximity to the target and explode at just the right moment. The idea sounded like science fiction. In 1940, British scientists had experimented with rudimentary radio wave concepts, but miniaturization and ruggedness were stumbling blocks. A shell fired from a 5-inch gun endured 20,000 Gs of acceleration and spun at over 500 revolutions per second. No fragile vacuum tube could survive such violence, until American physicists at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory found a way. By 1942, the United States had perfected what became the Variable Time Fuse, or VT fuse. Inside its small casing lay a miniature radio transmitter and a receiver. As the shell flew, it emitted a constant signal. If an aircraft passed nearby, the reflection altered the signal. The fuse detected the change and automatically triggered detonation at just the right instant. The Navy quickly realized the implications. With VT fuses, every anti-aircraft shell became a miniature radar-guided missile. Tests showed that shells equipped with the new fuse were 5 to 7 times more effective than those with timed fuses. Admiral Lewis Strauss would later call it second only to the atomic bomb in importance to the war effort. But secrecy was absolute. If the Japanese or Germans captured even one intact fuse, they might copy or develop countermeasures. The fuse was first deployed cautiously in the South Pacific in late 1942, where it proved devastating against Japanese aircraft at Guadalcanal. Sailors were astonished to see planes explode in midair from near misses that would once have been harmless. By 1944, the Navy had begun distributing VT fuses in quantity. They armed 5-inch guns on destroyers, cruisers, and carriers, transforming fleet defense. Yet when the kamikaze threat erupted at Leyte Gulf, few Americans understood just how vital the fuse would become. Suicide planes did not fly predictable attack patterns. They came straight in, often low and fast, intent on crashing no matter what. This demanded split-second destruction, not distant barrages. The fuse delivered exactly that. Each shell became a deadly bubble of invisible radio energy. A Zero diving at 350 knots might weave through streams of tracers, but if it passed within 70 feet of a VT-equipped shell, the warhead would erupt, shredding the aircraft with lethal fragments before it reached the ship. The sailors at Leyte did not yet know how decisively this innovation would alter their odds. For now, they faced flames, wreckage, and shock as the first kamikaze struck home. But within months, the Navy would measure a staggering transformation. Where early suicide attacks had scored frightening success, the introduction of VT fuses would reduce effective hits by up to 85%. The weapon remained a closely guarded secret, but for the men fighting in the Pacific, it was about to become their unseen guardian. By the spring of 1945, the American fleet gathered off Okinawa faced the most intense suicide assault of the war. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, required more than 1,300 ships, the largest amphibious armada of the Pacific. For Tokyo, the defense of the Ryukyus was the decisive battle. Kamikaze units were organized on an unprecedented scale, with hundreds of aircraft set aside for waves of sacrificial sorties. The Japanese called it kikusui, floating chrysanthemum. Between April and June, 10 massive kamikaze offensives hurled nearly 1,900 suicide aircraft at the Allied fleet. Pilots, many barely trained teenagers, were told their deaths would save Japan. American sailors called it simply the Storm of Steel. On April 6th, the first great wave struck. Radar screens lit up with inbound formations. Combat air patrols intercepted many, but dozens broke through, diving on picket destroyers and carriers. Ships bristled with fire as gunners opened up, 5-inch mounts roaring with new VT-fused shells. For the first time, the hidden technology revealed its true worth. Lieutenant Commander Fred Goldsmith, officer of the deck on USS Missouri, recalled, "We fired with the new proximity fuse. You could see the planes bursting apart in midair, not from direct hits, but from shells that seemed to know where they were." The effect was transformative. In earlier months, suicide planes often absorbed dozens of hits before crashing home. At Okinawa, observers noted Zeros and Oscars erupting into fragments hundreds of yards out, disintegrated by invisible hands. Where once a kamikaze's sheer determination seemed unstoppable, now defenses bit deep into the oncoming tide. Still, the price was severe. Kamikazes sank 36 Allied ships and damaged more than 350 during the Okinawan campaign, killing nearly 5,000 sailors, the deadliest toll for the U.S. Navy in any single operation. The destroyer USS Laffey, hit by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs on April 16th, somehow survived, saved in part by the ferocious umbrella of VT-fused fire from surrounding ships. Japanese after-action reports reflected stunned disbelief. The Fifth Air Fleet had expected overwhelming success, but instead, losses were catastrophic. Post-war interrogations revealed that some pilots believed American gunners had developed automatic aiming guns, or that ships carried new radar weapons which exploded aircraft before impact. Few ever understood the true nature of the device they faced. At Okinawa, the fuse proved decisive. Analysts later estimated that without VT-fused shells, kamikaze success rates might have doubled or even tripled. Instead, by late May, U.S. gunners were destroying 4 out of 5 attackers before they reached their targets. What had begun as a terrifying new weapon at Leyte Gulf was now being blunted by an equally revolutionary invention. For the sailors who stood on smoking decks and watched burning planes plunge into the sea, the victory was not abstract. The proximity fuse meant survival. Each detonation in the sky was one less funeral at sea. The battle for Okinawa marked the kamikaze's zenith and its ultimate defeat. By the summer of 1945, the kamikaze had lost its sting. What had begun with terrifying effectiveness at Leyte Gulf now met a wall of defenses that blunted Japan's last desperate weapon. Central to this reversal was the widespread adoption of the VT fuse across the Pacific Fleet. When the campaign for Okinawa opened, only a portion of American warships carried VT-fused shells in quantity. By May, the device had been rushed forward in vast numbers, ensuring nearly every 5-inch mount on destroyers, cruisers, and carriers was armed with the new fuse. The results were measurable and staggering. Where kamikazes had once scored a hit in nearly every 5th attack, by June, the success rate had dropped to less than 1 in 10. Navy statistics later credited the VT fuse with reducing effective kamikaze strikes by up to 85%.
Sailors could see the change with their own eyes. On picket stations, those isolated destroyers and escorts that bore the brunt of early suicide dives, gunners reported watching planes detonate hundreds of yards from their hulls. Lieutenant Charles Mason of the USS Hadley remembered, "The shells would burst near a zero and it would just vanish. We had never seen that kind of protection before." The Japanese noticed too. The diaries of the 5th Air Fleet reveal mounting frustration. Commanders complained that enemy ships now destroy our brave pilots in the air before impact. Post-war interrogations confirmed the despair. Some officers believed the Americans had invented radar bombs, others that their planes were being tracked by unseen magnetic waves. None ever learned the truth until after surrender. Even with the fuse, kamikazes remained dangerous. Ships still burned and men still died. But the massed suicide raids that Japanese planners had hoped would cripple the American fleet instead became slaughters in the skies. In the final Kikusui waves of May and June 1945, losses exceeded 80% before pilots reached their targets. Entire squadrons vanished under the curtain of VT-triggered fire. For the United States Navy, the fuse was more than just a weapon. It was a psychological shield. Confidence returned to crews who had once watched helplessly as suicide planes smashed into steel decks. Admiral Chester Nimitz later admitted that without the VT fuse, the Okinawa campaign might have been unbearably costly. By July, as U.S. carriers struck the Japanese home islands and B-29s firebombed Tokyo, the kamikaze threat had been broken. The tactic had promised salvation to Japan's high command, but against the invisible reach of the VT fuse, it had bled the nation's air strength dry. In the words of Admiral Lewis Strauss, the atomic bomb ended the war, but the proximity fuse saved the Navy. The tide had turned. The sea lanes to victory now lay open. Beneath the statistics and technological triumphs lay the sobering reality that every kamikaze strike, successful or not, was written in human lives. For the Americans at sea, the experience was searing. A sailor aboard the destroyer USS Laffey, after enduring 6 suicide crashes in a single day, described the smell of burning flesh and cordite mingling in the air. "We fought for hours in smoke so thick you could taste it. The guns shook the deck, but it was the screams of the wounded that I remember most." Survivors carried such memories long after the war ended. More than 4,900 American sailors were killed by kamikazes between late 1944 and 1945. Each loss reverberated through close-knit crews. Shipmates watched friends torn apart on the gun line or incinerated in engine rooms. On carriers, explosions swept through hangar decks filled with fuel and bombs, leaving survivors to pick through wreckage that had once been their homes. Even when VT fuses blunted the threat, terror lingered. Every distant drone of an engine might herald another suicide plane, another split-second test of nerves. For the Japanese, the toll was even more devastating. Nearly 3,800 kamikaze sorties were launched, claiming the lives of thousands of young pilots. Many were students pulled from universities, given only weeks of flight training, and told their sacrifice would save their family and homeland. Letters home revealed their quiet resignation. 17-year-old pilot Ichizo Hayashi wrote, "Mother, do not grieve. Tomorrow I will dive. My body will be the shield of the emperor." Yet post-war interrogations revealed that not all were willing. Some commanders admitted that coercion was common. Pilots who hesitated were shamed before their peers or reminded of the honor of dying for the emperor. Once in the cockpit, there was no turning back. Escorts often flew behind to ensure no one returned alive. American crews wrestled with conflicting emotions. Many hated the kamikazes for the destruction they caused, yet others pitied them, recognizing that these were young men no different than themselves, caught in the machinery of war. After the war, Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell remarked, "They were brave, but they died for nothing. That is the true tragedy." The VT fuse, while hailed as a savior by American sailors, only deepened the tragedy for Japan. It rendered the sacrifice of thousands of pilots futile. Missions planned to cripple entire fleets instead ended with planes bursting into fragments hundreds of yards from their targets. Brave men, some barely out of boyhood, vanished in the sky without ever striking a blow. By 1945, both sides knew the kamikaze was a weapon of desperation. For the Americans, the fuse had tipped the balance. For the Japanese, it meant the last reservoir of sacrifice was being spent in vain. The human cost, tens of thousands dead in sky and sea, was the unshakable legacy of that final brutal year of the Pacific War. The proximity fuse seemed almost magical to the sailors who watched Japanese aircraft disintegrate in midair, but behind the miracle lay years of scientific struggle and extraordinary ingenuity. The story began not on the decks of warships, but in laboratories and workshops, where physicists, engineers, and machinists labored to solve a problem that had frustrated militaries for decades. Traditional solutions were painfully limited. Contact fuses required a direct hit, an unlikely event when a shell the size of a 5-inch round was fired at a maneuvering aircraft. Timed fuses, set by mechanical predictors, relied on guesswork about altitude, speed, and trajectory. Too early or too late, and the shell detonated harmlessly in the empty sky. The result was wasteful barrages of hundreds of shells for every one plane destroyed. As aircraft grew faster, these methods fell further behind.
As the shell traveled, it sent out a radio signal. If an aircraft entered its field, the returning echo caused interference, which the circuit detected. Within milliseconds, the fuse triggered detonation. The technical obstacles were staggering. A 5-inch anti-aircraft shell endured 20,000 times the force of gravity when fired, and spun at more than 30,000 revolutions per minute. No existing electronic component could survive such punishment. The solution came from miniaturization and rugged design. Engineers shrank vacuum tubes, the heart of the circuit, into tiny, shock-resistant versions no bigger than a thumb. They were encased in epoxy, with filaments engineered to withstand crushing acceleration. By early 1942, prototypes proved they could work. The Navy rushed to test them under combat conditions. In the South Pacific, destroyers equipped with VT fused astonished crews by blasting Japanese bombers out of the sky with only a few rounds. The success was so striking that secrecy became paramount. Sailors were forbidden to recover unexploded shells, lest the enemy learn the secret. Crews were told never to fire VT-fused rounds over land for fear that a dud might fall into Axis hands. Manufacturing the fuse became one of the war's greatest industrial undertakings. At its peak, American factories produced nearly 40,000 proximity fuses per day, an effort employing more than 20,000 workers across multiple states. The scale of the program rivaled that of radar and the Manhattan Project. In fact, President Roosevelt was briefed that the proximity fuse was one of the 3 wonder weapons of the Allied arsenal, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. The fuse's versatility soon expanded beyond shipboard defense. Field artillery units in Europe adopted it in late 1944, just in time for the Battle of the Bulge. American gunners fired VT-fused shells into the snowy forests of the Ardennes, where they burst above German infantry like lethal air mines. Veterans recalled the devastating effect. "The shells exploded over our heads," one German officer later admitted, "and there was no cover that could save us." At sea, however, the fuse's impact was most profound. By arming every 5-inch mount with VT shells, the U.S. Navy had turned each warship into a floating flak battery of unprecedented accuracy. Kamikaze pilots who once believed they could dodge fire found themselves shredded hundreds of yards from their targets. What had been a weapon of terror was reduced, in many cases, to little more than fiery wreckage splashing harmlessly into the waves.
For the sailors who depended on it, the fuse was nothing less than salvation. They did not always understand the science, but they saw its results in burning aircraft and empty skies. For the scientists who built it, the fuse was proof that abstract physics and engineering could tip the scales of war, saving lives not by brute force, but by precision. The kamikaze would not vanish overnight, but with each passing month of 1945, the VT fuse helped ensure that fewer of them reached their mark. Science, secrecy, and sacrifice had combined to give the fleet its most reliable shield. By July 1945, the Japanese Empire stood on the brink of collapse. Its fleet lay at the bottom of the Pacific, its air force shredded, its cities burning from relentless B-29 firebombing. Yet from scattered airfields on Kyushu and the southern islands, Japan still launched kamikaze attacks, each raid a final act of defiance against overwhelming odds. The last of these suicide offenses bore little resemblance to the disciplined strikes at Leyte or the massed waves of Okinawa. The aircraft were often obsolete trainers, battered Zeros, or even wooden gliders loaded with explosives. The pilots were younger than ever, many only 17 or 18, hastily taught to take off and point their aircraft at a target. They knew they would never return. American sailors, hardened by months of combat, faced these raids with grim efficiency. By this stage, nearly every warship's 5-inch guns were supplied exclusively with VT-fused shells. The effect was devastating. Kamikazes rarely made it within sight of their targets. Instead, they disintegrated in the sky, exploding into fragments hundreds of yards out, their sacrifice ending in fireballs that never touched steel. On July 28, 1945, a small formation of suicide planes attempted to strike the fleet off Okinawa. Radar picked them up at 20 miles. Combat air patrols slashed into their ranks, downing half before they reached gunnery range. The rest plunged forward, only to be met by a barrage of proximity-fused fire. Observers aboard the battleship USS South Dakota recalled the spectacle. It was like fireworks in daylight. Planes would vanish into puffs of flame, each burst marking another one stopped cold. None broke through. For the Japanese command, the results were heartbreaking. The last waves of Kikusui attacks in May and June had already shown appalling losses, with up to 80% of planes destroyed before reaching their targets. By August, that number climbed even higher. Pilots were dying in droves, yet the tally of ships sunk dwindled to almost nothing. Admiral Matame Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet, insisted on leading one final kamikaze sortie on August 15, 1945, the very day Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Ugaki and his small group of volunteers vanished into the Pacific, their mission futile, their deaths unrecorded by any American loss. The futility was not lost on those who survived. Post-war interrogations revealed bitterness among Japanese officers who had watched thousands of young men sacrificed for little gain. Some admitted that by mid-1945, kamikaze raids had become symbolic gestures rather than militarily effective tactics. The Americans had simply adapted too quickly, and the VT fuse had sealed the tactic's fate. For U.S. sailors, the final months were no less tense. Every radar contact still raised alarm. Every drone of an approaching engine could mean death, but confidence had replaced despair. The terrifying image of unstoppable kamikazes at Leyte had given way to the knowledge that their defenses could, and usually would, hold. Gunners even took grim pride in watching their proximity-fused shells burst true, shredding the enemy before impact.
When the war ended in August, the statistics told the story plainly. Of the nearly 3,800 kamikaze sorties launched, about 14% managed to hit a ship. That figure might have been 2 or 3 times higher without the proximity fuse. The device had not eliminated the kamikaze, but it had robbed the weapon of its decisive power. In the final weeks, Japanese pilots had hurled themselves into hopeless skies.
their sacrifice blunted by invisible technology they never understood. The Kamikaze's promise of salvation for Japan had become only a symbol of its desperation, extinguished in fireballs above the sea. The war was ending, and with it, the age of the kamikaze. The thunder of war in the Pacific finally subsided in August 1945. For the sailors who had spent months staring into the skies, bracing for the shriek of diving kamikazes, peace was not just an end to combat, but an end to terror. Yet the memory of those suicide planes never truly faded. The image of a Zero plummeting into a carrier's deck, or the explosion of aviation fuel engulfing a destroyer, haunted survivors long after they returned home. They had lived through one of history's most desperate gambits, a weapon that sought to substitute human sacrifice for strategy. But what turned the tide against this onslaught was not merely the courage of men at the guns. It was a piece of technology so small and secretive that most sailors who owed their lives to it never saw it with their own eyes: the proximity, or VT, fuse. The fuse had been conceived in the laboratories of American physicists and engineers years earlier, at a time when the war still raged in Europe. Unlike conventional timed or contact fuses, the VT fuse used a tiny radio transmitter inside each shell. It could sense when it was near an aircraft, detonating the shell at precisely the right distance. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it required the miniaturization of vacuum tubes and circuitry, rugged enough to survive the immense shock of being fired from a naval gun. By 1943, prototypes were ready, and by late 1944, the Navy began to ship them in quantity to the Pacific. Their deployment coincided with the rise of the kamikaze threat. The timing could not have been more critical. At first, however, the weapon remained cloaked in secrecy. Sailors were not told exactly how the shells worked, only that they were special. Their effectiveness became apparent quickly. At Leyte Gulf, kamikazes had torn through the fleet with devastating success. By Okinawa, just months later, the story was different. A formation of suicide planes approaching a carrier group would find itself flying into an invisible wall of explosions. Destroyers like the USS Laffey, which endured an incredible onslaught of 22 kamikaze attacks in a single day, survived in large part because proximity-fused shells turned what had once been guesswork into near certainty. The results were measurable. Post-war analyses by the U.S. Navy credited the VT fuse with increasing anti-aircraft effectiveness by a factor of 5. More than 50% of kamikaze aircraft destroyed by shipboard guns in 1945 were brought down by shells equipped with proximity fuses. Admiral Chester Nimitz summarized it bluntly: the proximity fuse saved the fleet. Without it, the bloodletting off Okinawa could have been catastrophic, and plans for an invasion of Japan might have been rendered far more costly. For the men who lived through those battles, the fuse was more than a statistic. Sailors described what it was like to see incoming planes suddenly erupt in midair. One veteran of the destroyer USS Hazelwood remembered watching a Zero disintegrate 100 yards from the ship. He recalled decades later, "It was the first time I believed we had a chance." On the carrier USS Enterprise, which absorbed multiple kamikaze strikes in 1945, crewmen spoke of how the new ammunition finally made their anti-aircraft batteries feel equal to the task. The skies, once an arena of helplessness, became fields of controlled firepower. The Japanese, meanwhile, never understood why their losses mounted so rapidly. Post-war interrogations revealed a striking blind spot. Kamikaze pilots had been trained to expect heavy fire, but not the uncanny accuracy they encountered in 1945. Some survivors claimed they believed American gunners had simply become preternaturally skilled. One officer admitted in 1946, "We thought the gods had abandoned us. We did not know it was science." This ignorance had profound consequences. The kamikaze campaign was premised on the belief that sheer willpower could punch through American defenses. Japanese commanders hoped that enough suicide planes crashing into carriers and transports would cripple the fleet and sap American morale. But when loss rates climbed above 80% by mid-1945, the strategy faltered. Ships were still damaged, sailors still killed, yet the decisive effect Japan had sought never materialized. The unseen hand of the VT fuse ensured that kamikaze sacrifices achieved little beyond tragedy. The broader legacy of the fuse extended beyond its immediate battlefield impact. It represented a triumph of applied science in warfare, a quiet counterpart to the atomic bomb. Whereas the bomb symbolized overwhelming destructive power, the fuse embodied precision, efficiency, and defense. Together, they illustrated the dual paths of technological innovation in World War II. Annihilation on one hand, protection on the other. The fuse was also a model of collaboration. The U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development coordinated work between university physicists, private industry, and the military. Companies like Crosley Radio produced millions of miniature tubes for fuses, while Navy logistics ensured they reached the front. It was a national effort, compressed into secrecy, that changed the outcome of countless battles. The story did not end in 1945. In the decades that followed, the VT fuse's principle became foundational for modern weaponry. Proximity sensors, radar-guided missiles, and automated defense systems all owed a debt to the technology first crammed inside a 5-inch shell. Every modern naval task force that relies on missile defense traces its lineage to those shells fired against kamikazes in the Pacific. There was also a human legacy, one forged in memory and reconciliation. In 1962, during a U.S.-Japanese aviation symposium in Hawaii, veterans from both sides gathered to share experiences. It was there that former kamikaze pilots learned for the first time why so many of their comrades had perished before reaching their targets. The revelation stunned them. One veteran reportedly murmured, "We thought our bodies would be unstoppable weapons. Now I see we were flying into invisible fire." For the Americans present, the moment underscored how secrecy had defined the weapon's role, saving lives as it remained hidden from those it defeated. By the 1980s, when surviving Pacific veterans held reunions in Hawaii, stories of the VT fuse had become part of the shared memory of the war. Sailors spoke of it with reverence. They knew it had been the difference between survival and annihilation, between a war that ended in 1945 and one that might have dragged into 1946 with horrific losses. Yet, in a larger sense, the kamikaze and the VT fuse are remembered together, two sides of the same story. One embodied desperation, the other ingenuity. One was rooted in sacrifice, the other in science. Both became symbols of the Pacific War's final year. The kamikaze pilots carried Japan's last hope into the sky. The VT fuse extinguished that hope with bursts of fire too precise to comprehend. As the decades pass, the lessons remain. War accelerates invention, but it also magnifies human tragedy. The kamikaze attacks killed thousands of Americans and tens of thousands of Japanese. The VT fuse saved perhaps just as many. Its story reminds us that wars are not decided only by courage or sacrifice, but also by unseen forces, technologies, ideas, and choices that shift outcomes in silence. The Pacific War began with a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, planes diving from the sky against an unready fleet. It ended with another surprise, a secret invention that robbed Japan's most desperate weapon of its sting. Small, unglamorous, and hidden within a shell casing, the proximity fuse altered the trajectory of history. In the final accounting, kamikaze pilots gave everything for their nation, but they never knew why their efforts failed. American sailors fought bravely, but they never fully understood what invisible ally stood behind their guns. History now gives us the perspective they lacked, that in the clash between sacrifice and science, science prevailed. The VT fuse did not just save ships, it saved the future.